Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that the discovery that sets the Richardson house trembling is not a scream or a confession but a folded scrap of evidence pulled out of an old winter coat. It is the sort of small, domestic thing that refuses to look like a clue until someone with the right kind of stubbornness refuses to let it be ordinary. Kat finds it while rifling through crates in the back of a storage unit, a receipt, creased and yellowed at the corners, with a purchaser's name scrawled in block letters. Leslie. The receipt is for a jacket, a detail so mundane that it hums with plausibility. The jacket is the same color, the same cut, the same threadbare habit that a witness described to police the night Laura was struck by a motorcycle and left for dead. The receipt is a thread, and Kat pulls it, though she cannot know which way it will unravel the rest of their lives. Nicole comes to the scene with the kind of face strained by too many boardroom negotiations and lawyer meetings. Her divorce from Ted was a bruise that had gone flat, painful once, then oddly numb. The legal papers had been signed months ago, but the emotional arithmetic had been busied by other things. For weeks she had focused on closing accounts, changing locks, and letting the little rituals of domesticity slide into new grooves. She had told herself that grief could be parceled neatly into tasks. When Kat shows her the receipt, the neatness fractures. A memory jolts through her, the hospital corridor, a beep in the night, Laura's hand so pale and slack it looked transparent. Nicole had been outraged then, but also exhausted. She had filed away a suspicion about a sudden spike in Laura's blood potassium levels, a technicality the doctors called hyperkalemia, and then life had dragged her away like a current. Divorce papers, Ted's harried calls, the smear of humiliation and betrayal, all of it conspired to make her forget the small, vital details that might have pointed to malice rather than accident. The receipt calls them back. The initial report about Laura that she had been hit by a motorcycle had read like an accident, an unlucky crosswalk, a tip of a wheel, the sort of story that invites sympathy and then is quickly folded away for the next headline. But Laura's case had a strange wrinkle. At the hospital the lab results had looked like a code that refused to make sense. Her potassium, the doctors said, had spiked to lethal levels. Her kidneys had reacted as if under assault. Her heart had flirted with arrhythmia. A toxicologist's shrug became a specter. Hyperkalemia can be caused by many things: medication mismanagement, kidney failure, or the deliberate administration of potassium. Deliberate? The word wobbled when Nicole tried to say it out loud. She'd been through too many interrogations of the past to hazard accusations. There were plausible explanations. A faulty prescription, a misread chart, the sloppy negligence of a busy clinic. But the receipt refuses the convenience of that explanation. It suggests intention. Kat, for all her glamour, has an old streak of sleuthing in her. The modeling world teaches you to read faces not just as a visual skill but as a defensive one, the ability to decode a photographer's glance, a stylist's impatience. She applies that skill to evidence. Mona, who has been a quiet guardian figure to the Richardsons long before the tabloids learned the family name, brings a different kind of acumen. Mona's loyalty is not transactional. It has developed over cups of burnt coffee in cramped kitchens, over scraped knees and secret confidences. She treats Laura like a daughter, perhaps because in a life that has often demanded loyalty from those who had nothing to lose, she can choose that attachment and make it matter. She knows how to listen. And she knows how to read the pattern in a person's story. When Kat brings the receipt to her, Mona pauses, fingers on the paper, and says one word: finally. The three of them form a peculiar investigative triangle: Kat, whose life has been built in high-visibility flashes but who now finds meaning in the shadowy; Nicole, who blends legal tenacity with maternal urgency; and Mona, whose roots are practical and whose instincts are cultivated by years of seeing what others sweep away. They begin to talk, not with the stiff formality of police, but with the intimacy of women who have been hurt by the same system that promises protection. Laura has been quiet since the accident, but her silence is not empty. It's full of fragments she cannot yet put together. The trio coax those fragments out, piece by paper piece, like archaeologists brushing away mud to reveal a bone. Laura's narrative is not linear. Trauma has a way of shearing memory into splinters, The mind keeps the jagged edges and rearranges them by necessity. She recalls the motorcycle, the sound like a distant insect, the sudden pain that felt as if it had been administered by a precise instrument rather than a blunt collision. She remembers the hospital linens and the ache of being watched. She remembers someone at her bedside, sitting with a mask of composure and saying the wrong things. Then she remembers the name. It is a name that presses against the dark, the alias Leslie had used to con people before, a name that has appeared in whispers in Nicole's hushed calls about dead. A name that gleams like a splinter in everyone's memory. When Laura says that Leslie visited her in the hospital, the room becomes small, the air tight as if oxygen has been sucked away by the thought of that woman stepping into a sick room with the calm of someone who knows how to pretend nobody else had come. That absence of family, of friends around a bedside becomes not just an oversight but an orchestration. People do not orchestrate absences unless they know what weight that absence will carry. Kat's eyes narrow as the details gather. Why would Leslie visit? She asks aloud, not because she expects a rational answer but because the question forces possibilities into light. Kat imagines scenarios: Leslie as a manipulator of sympathy, Leslie as a predatory presence who uses hospital visits as a theater to perform innocence, Leslie as the kind of person who can stand beside a bed and make the bereaved feel indebted. Mona answers in her own way, practical, provisional. Leslie has history with deception. Nicole, who knows the texture of Leslie's ruthlessness because she'd lived with Ted's betrayals and watched Leslie weaponize vulnerability, nods slowly. She sees a larger pattern: a woman who pursues damage like a hunter tracks prey, who uses other people's moments of crisis to insert herself and shape narratives. Theories accumulate like dishes at a crowded table. One of them, Kat, with a flair for the dramatic, proposes Eva as a motive. Eva was the woman who stepped into Laura's role at work, the access, the keys to the spaces Laura once navigated. In that cutthroat world, small slights become seismic. If Eva had ambitions and if Leslie had a grudge, the intersection could be ugly. The image of a replacement, of someone sliding into Laura's position like a hand into glove, touches a nerve. People imagine lines drawn and territories claimed. But motive must be anchored in fact. And the fact that Laura hardly had any enemies complicates the picture. She was quiet, careful, the type of person who kept her head down and did good work. The idea that anyone would target her seems absurd until you trace the arch of how small decisions, an affair, a dismissal, a shuffled schedule, create a lattice of resentment that can harbor more dangerous instincts. Nicole, whose analytical mind refuses to allow emotion to be the only engine of action, turns to the practical. She arranges for their first informal audit. Recreate Laura's last week. They sit around Nicole's kitchen table with notepads, coffee gone cold, and reconstruct schedules, messages, the people who contacted Laura. They read emails aloud, bank statements, delivery notifications, and a private note from a neighbor, a fuzzy memory of a motorcycle engine revving on a night the lights were low. As they converse, threads appear that had seemed like loose ends. Leslie's imprints are everywhere once you look. A bill paid to a boutique, a social media interaction that glows with the subtlety of a planted lie, a local tenant remembering a woman who asked odd questions about schedules and habits. The world, however unwillingly, begins to show its seams. Mona's contribution is the kind of forensic intuition that comes from a life that values observation over theory. She had always been the one to notice small things, the way a neighbor's shoes were lined at the door, the fact that the butcher always wrapped meat the same way, the way a child would bounce in a particular pattern when feeling guilty. It is the type of attention that finds a clue where others see only the mundane. When she recognizes the style of the jacket, the frayed cuff, a particular seam pattern made by a boutique brand, she remembers a time Leslie mentioned going shopping and complaining about a sale. Mona reaches out to an old acquaintance who works the afternoon shift at a thrift store. The woman remembers a customer who fits Leslie's description and who bought a jacket for cash. The sale was recorded, oddly, not in the usual register but on a handwritten slip, a detail that suggests haste or a desire for anonymity. There is also Laura's body of small eccentricities, The details that once seemed trivial but now form a map of vulnerability. The hospital staff report that Laura was a woman who took specific supplements for a mild deficiency, the kind that interact with potassium levels. She had been careful about medication, noted when prescriptions were refilled, so the spike in potassium becomes less likely to be the result of self-neglect. Somebody had tampered with her intake, or else had administered a substance that altered her body chemistry. It is one of those technicalities that officials treat as data, but to the three women the medical facts acquire the weight of a personal violation. Someone had mapped Laura's body like a territory and declared war on it. At night, Nicole lies awake and sees Ted's face in the dark. But now the edges of his infidelity throb with a new meaning. It is not mere betrayal. It is the mechanism that allowed Leslie into their orbit. Nicole sees how his weakness of flirtation, a promise he did not keep, became a key Leslie turned in the lock of their lives. If Ted had not faltered, perhaps Leslie would never have found purchase. The equation is ugly and simple. Opportunity breeds malice. Nicole hates herself for indulging the thought that her personal failure had invited violence upon another, but she also knows that denial will not help Laura. So she doubles down on duty, allowing the guilt to be a fuel rather than a chain. Kat moves between public and private with surprising ease. On the surface, her life is still the one that yields glossy magazine shots and runway applause. But the gig economy of celebrity has taught her to mask interior tremors under a practiced smile. She uses that mask as a means to access people who otherwise might not speak. There are stylists and assistants who owe her favors, journalists who will trade a tip for a scoop, and an informal network of friends who live at the crossroads of industry and gossip. She calls in favors, arranges meetings with strangers who might have seen the motorcycle that night, persuades a parking attendant to scavenge his memory for clues. Kat, ever the persuasive storyteller, can make a stranger feel as if his recollection is part of a larger narrative about justice. She learns the dangerous art of converting gossip into evidence. Mona becomes their anchor. She sits through long interviews with police officers, asks questions whose bluntness would be insulting coming from anyone else, and pries. Police reports, they discover, are a collection of priorities. The things prosecutors think they can prove quickly are valued over slow, nuanced investigations that may require patience and resources. The Richardson women do not have a patient public. They have a public that wants immediate answers and a court that will reward neatness over depth. So they build their own investigation, not in defiance of the law but as a complement to it. They know that the system will work better if they hand the right materials to it. Their goal is not to enact vigilante justice but to create an evidentiary trail that will compel official action. The first breakthrough comes not with a dramatic confession but with the quiet confirmation of an alibi that unravels like a crooked seam. Leslie, after weeks of evasive texts and plausible denials, is tied to the jacket purchased by the receipt Mona found. It is not the entire case, but it is where the line between suspicion and probable cause begins to glow. The receipt state matches witness reports of a woman in the vicinity around the time of the accident. It also correlates with a suspicious social media post Leslie had made, which was later scrubbed, a pattern familiar to anyone who watches the choreography of denial. People who lie often try to make their absence into a plausible presence. They fabricate alibis that flirt with coherence but fall apart under scrutiny. Leslie's alibi is a mode of performance. The receipt is a thread that reveals the stitches. The emotional stakes quietly amplify. Laura, who has spent days in the kind of quiet that trauma demands, begins to show signs of trauma's peculiar rituals. She obsesses over certain details, she sleeps poorly, and she has a delayed startle when she hears engines. But she also grows more determined. The woman who had once devoted herself to a quiet life now begins to press for the truth, not just for her own peace but because she knows the particular cruelty of having your life rewritten by absence. She wants an account for the things that were taken from her, the ability to walk without looking over her shoulder, the sensible routine of work, and the quiet dignity that had been hers before that night. Her voice, when it comes, is wary but steady. It is the tone of someone who has been violated and chooses, with great effort, To reclaim narrative, evidence accumulates. A grainy surveillance camera catches a motorbike with a license plate partially obscured. An auto repair shop remembers fixing a similar bike on the morning after the accident. A delivery truck driver reports seeing a woman who matched Leslie's description asking a suspicious question about her neighbor's comings and goings. Each piece is small, but together they form a lattice. The trio learn to read the law's appetite. They know prosecutors will need not dramatic conclusions but a chain of facts that tie motive to means. They collect receipts, witness statements, a discarded glove that was found near the scene, lace fibers that match the thread of the jacket. They build, painstakingly, the kind of case the courthouse might accept. All the while, social undercurrents press upon their efforts. Leslie does not remain static while accusations coalesce. She marshals her own defenses, a wave of social media sympathizers who paint her as a victim of falsehoods, a sudden performance of good deeds, and a litany of legal threats meant to cow the investigators into silence. The world has learned to weaponize narrative. The mere appearance of conflict can be spun into a counter-accusation. Kat finds herself managing not only evidence but also the optics of accusation. She is aware of how quickly a collective can turn on someone who seeks accountability. The press loves both rise and ruin, and it will not hesitate to pivot if the story loses its tidy lines. So they proceed with caution, letting only confirmed facts out into the public domain and keeping the rest as armor in their private dossier. The strain begins to show. Nicole, who has been stoic by nature, snaps at a neighbor's question about her divorce and wonders aloud whether Ted knew how close he had came to enabling something monstrous. She has to remind herself that blame does not always lie on the surface. That culpability is sometimes an accident whose consequences are catastrophic. Meanwhile, Mona becomes a quiet warrior. She spends nights tracking down a phone number that had seemed trivial until she realizes the number was paid from Leslie's account the week of the accident. It is a small victory but it feels enormous. For Laura, every small victory is a reclamation. It is as if each corroboration is a lamp in a dark corridor. As momentum builds, a new fear takes root. What if their search only scratches the surface? What if Leslie is a conduit for an even wider network of grudges and arrangements? The trio faces the possibility that the conspiracy, if it exists, is more diffuse than a lone antagonist. Leslie could be an agent and not the origin, a person used by someone else to inflict harm. The idea chills them. It forces them to widen their inquiry, to test the perimeters of relationships that might have seemed harmless. Colleagues' rivalries, a landlord's resentment, a petty jealousy turned violent. At the end of a long day that feels like the slow making of a new map for their lives, they gather in Nicole's living room with files spread across the coffee table. The weight of the evidence is tangible and the air in the room is thick with a sense of imminent change. The bike's partial plate sits on someone's mobile screen. Mona has a copy of the thrift shop slip. Laura holds her hospital bracelet with fingers that tremble. For the first time since the accident, there is a clear line drawn between a person they suspect and the facts they can present. But even with this line, the conclusion is not yet inevitable. The law will need more. The courts demand a narrative of motive that is both persuasive and legally sound. They must prove Leslie not only had the opportunity but also the reason. That is where their next efforts will be focused. Motive must be crystallized, the spike in potassium must be tied to a deliberate act, and the motorcycle must be traceable to a rider whose movement aligns with Leslie's presence. They have reason to be hopeful. The ragged geometry of evidence is folding into a shape that prosecutors might accept. Yet the final steps are fragile. There is risk in haste. There is also risk in delay. The trio sit in that liminal space, aware that their next moves could either secure justice or create new vulnerabilities. Outside, the city hums along, indifferent, while inside a quiet reckoning prepares to make its move. The case is no longer only about Laura's recovery, it is about whether a woman whose life was nearly extinguished can reclaim agency, whether a family can weave back together the torn seams of trust, and whether a community that had once been complacent about small cruelties will finally notice the pattern and act. They do not yet know the full extension of Leslie's reach, nor do they have the complete documentary proof that will make the arrests unavoidable. But they have momentum and a stubborn persistence that comes from being wronged and refusing to be passive. As they prepare to turn their file over to a sympathetic detective who has promised to listen, they also prepare for the inevitable fallout, public scrutiny, counter-accusations, the way rumors metastasize. They know they will have to be careful, and yet they also know they cannot retreat. At the end of that day, with the receipt taped into a dossier and a string of corroborations beginning to make sense, the three women step out into the night, each of them carrying the tiredness of the fight and the strange, fierce light of a plan beginning to take shape. The evidence they had pieced together, spread across the coffee table like fragments of a puzzle, was enough to feel like progress but not enough to secure the closure they all craved. The receipt, the potassium anomaly, the jacket, the hospital visit, each element shimmered with implication, but what the law demanded was more: a chain unbroken, motive tied cleanly to action, the kind of airtight narrative that prosecutors could wield in court without fear of collapse. The trio knew this, and the weight of expectation hung in the room like an anchor. Laura's hands trembled as she held her hospital bracelet, a small piece of plastic that had become a symbol of survival. Nicole stared at it too, knowing that for all her professional battles and personal scars, this fight mattered more than any other. Kat paced, restless energy radiating from her as if her body needed movement to keep despair at bay, while Mona sat quietly, eyes sharp, her silence carrying more gravity than words. The days that followed were marked by a strange duality. The mundane rhythm of life continued: morning coffee, errands, the routine interruptions of neighbors and colleagues, but beneath it was a relentless undercurrent of strategy and investigation. Nicole leveraged her legal instincts, pressing contacts she once avoided, combing through case files, and pushing detectives to revisit reports that had been prematurely closed. Kat took advantage of her visibility, weaving into the public conversation subtle hints of a larger truth, careful not to expose Laura but determined to keep Leslie from controlling the narrative. Mona, steady and grounded, became the glue that held the fragile group together, ensuring meetings happened, notes were organized, and no one collapsed under the weight of grief or guilt. Laura herself, though fragile, grew stronger each day. Her recollections became clearer, sharper, as if the act of being believed had unlocked parts of her memory that fear had locked away. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, as breakthroughs often do. A mechanic from the auto repair shop, who had earlier mentioned a suspicious motorcycle, came forward again after seeing Kat's carefully phrased interview in a lifestyle magazine. He recalled that the rider, a woman, had insisted the scratches on her bike came from a collision with debris, though the damage told a different story. He remembered the jacket too, the one Mona had recognized, and more importantly, he remembered the partial license plate number. With this, law enforcement could cross-check registration data. It was not conclusive, but it was a map leading directly to Leslie. Suddenly, the picture sharpened: a motive forged from bitterness and betrayal, means in the form of a bike and a poisoned plan, opportunity proven by receipts and hospital visits. The women knew they were closer than ever, yet that closeness carried its own danger. Leslie, sensing the tightening noose, retaliated in the way people like her always did, with manipulation. She began painting herself publicly as a victim, planting stories that suggested Nicole had orchestrated a smear campaign out of jealousy and bitterness from her divorce. Anonymous accounts sprang up online, praising Leslie's strength while subtly discrediting Laura's memory and Kat's involvement. It was character assassination by stealth, and for a time, it worked. Journalists, hungry for conflict, framed the unfolding drama as he said, she said, stripping away the complexity and reducing real pain to spectacle. Laura was devastated. She had survived physical harm only to see her credibility attacked. Nicole bristled with fury but knew reacting recklessly would only give Leslie more power. Mona urged patience. Kat, ever fiery, wanted to expose Leslie outright but was persuaded to hold back until the evidence could carry more weight. The case reached its crescendo when a toxicology expert agreed to re-examine Laura's medical records. What they found confirmed Nicole's earliest suspicion: The spike in potassium was not natural. It bore the marks of deliberate interference, most likely from an injected solution. Combined with testimony of Leslie's unauthorized hospital visit, the case transformed from speculation to a prosecutable offense. The chain of evidence was complete enough for an arrest warrant. When the news broke that Leslie had been taken into custody, the relief was immense but strangely muted. For Laura, justice was not about celebration but about the possibility of safety. For Nicole, it was a complicated vindication, knowing that Ted's infidelity had opened the door to Leslie's hatred. For Kat, it was bittersweet victory tinged with the knowledge that fame had again become entangled with violence. For Mona, it was a quiet confirmation of what she had known all along: persistence and loyalty can pierce even the thickest lies. But endings are rarely neat. Leslie, even behind bars, remained venomous. She continued to deny responsibility, hinting at shadowy conspirators and insisting she was a scapegoat. Ted, for his part, faded into the background, stripped of credibility and dignity, his betrayal laid bare in the harshest light. Nicole found herself at a crossroads, unsure whether to rebuild her life in quiet anonymity or to step forward and reclaim her place in the public eye. Kat, though celebrated for her role in uncovering the truth, began questioning what kind of spotlight she wanted: one that devoured pain for entertainment, or one that amplified resilience without erasure. Laura, finally free to heal, focused not on revenge but on reclaiming her agency, seeking therapy, and slowly learning to trust her own strength again. The true conclusion, however, was not in the arrest or the trial that followed, but in the solidarity forged between these women. Nicole, Kat, Mona, and Laura had been bound together by tragedy, but what they created out of it was a testament to survival, to the fierce insistence that justice is possible even when the odds are bent against you. Their bond became unbreakable, a quiet alliance that would outlast the headlines and the whispers. When the verdict finally arrived, guilty on multiple counts, they sat together in the courtroom, hands linked under the table, their silence louder than any applause. Leslie's hatred had been powerful, but it had not destroyed them. If anything, it had revealed the depth of their resilience. As the world moved on, as new scandals and stories replaced theirs in the public's fickle attention, they found solace in the ordinary. Nicole found peace in her new independence, learning that freedom was not the absence of pain but the presence of choice. Kat carved a new path, balancing her career with advocacy, determined to ensure that Laura's story would not be twisted into mere spectacle. Mona remained their anchor, proof that loyalty was not about blood but about choosing, day after day, to stand by those you love. And Laura, perhaps the most remarkable of them all, embraced the long road of healing, her scars a reminder not of weakness but of endurance. Beyond the gates of the courtroom, beyond the gates of betrayal and violence, lay the possibility of renewal. The ending was not triumphant in the cinematic sense, but it was real: four women walking out into the light together, their shadows stretching behind them, their future no longer defined by the harm inflicted but by the strength they carried forward.